Hey everybody, what is going on? In this episode, I'm going to review the Imagineering story, episode 3 on Disney+. So in this episode, they touched upon the Eisner era, okay? Now, this era is kind of the birth, so to speak, of modern mega corporation Disney, okay? Before the Eisner era, Disney, it wasn't like a mom and pop company necessarily, but it just wasn't like this gargantuanly huge corporation. And once Eisner and Frank Wells took over, it really changed the company forever. Okay, it went from a fairly small company that really only dealt with like the studio and like a few theme parks to this mega corporation. And this era was the birth of that. And they touched upon a lot of interesting topics in this episode, one of which was bringing outside IP into Disney parks. Now, before Eisner, they never did this. So the idea of bringing Star Wars or Indiana Jones into the fold, into the Disney parks, was kind of a controversial one. It was kind of a split thing within the company as to whether they should or shouldn't do that. And the thing that I found interesting about this was because at that time, it was scary for a lot of people in the company to even consider doing this. How are you going to bring Star Wars? It's not even Disney. Why are you going to bring that into Disneyland or Indiana Jones or, all these outside properties? People kind of thought it was a little bit of a blasphemous almost. Like, how could you even consider that? And it kind of reminds me a lot of the conversations that took place in the fandom after Disney bought Marvel. There was a lot of that same conversations about, oh, well, Marvel, that's not Disney. That's not a very Disney property. How can you bring that into the parks, or how can you incorporate that? And, just like Indiana Jones and just like Star Wars, I think it'll fit in just right. I think change always feels scary, and it's really different when it happens. But as time goes on, the old saying, time heals all wounds, it's sort of the same idea with that. And I think a lot of the stuff that we find weird and scary and different that's happening now, we'll look back on it in 20 years and go, oh, okay, yeah, it's normal. Just like we did with Indiana Jones and Star Wars. But I liked how they touched upon that. How it was a different situation at that era. And it was Eisner's attempt to really revitalize the company and the parks and make it kind of like the hip thing to do, right? He really tapped into that market, and it worked. And the park saw a major growth under Michael Eisner and Frank Wells. And especially Florida. They touched upon that in this episode as well, that Florida, they really saw a huge expansion with the creation of Disney-MGM Studios, now known as Disney's Hollywood Studios, and the creation of that whole park and bringing a movie-based studio to Orlando. This was the one thing, though, that I kind of criticized this series over. In my last 2 reviews, I mentioned that they didn't really sugarcoat or make this like a fluff piece. With the Disney-MGM stuff, they kind of did a little bit because really it's on record. Michael Eisner really built Disney-MGM Studios as an answer to Universal. Okay, that was really the inspiration to create an answer to a counter to Universal Studios. And they didn't mention that in this documentary. They made it seem like more coming from a place of like genuine inspiration. Like, yeah, wouldn't it be great if we had a working studio and yada, yada, yada. Well, that's not entirely the truth. There was a lot of motivation to kind of take on Universal, on their turf, so to speak, and that was a big push for Disney-MGM Studios, and they left that out of this episode. Okay, so I thought that was a little bit of them trying to kind of sugarcoat it a little bit, but then they dived into Disneyland Paris, and they were very honest with that. They were saying how it was, it was very ambitious. They overspent on the park and the hotels. There were too many hotel rooms, and all the political upheaval with Disney being in France and how people just didn't feel like it fit in with their culture. Very honest assessment of that whole situation, which I appreciated. I thought that was very, very cool. One thing I really also want to touch upon is the importance of Frank Wells. Okay, the importance of Frank Wells. Frank Wells, a lot of people credit Eisner to the Disney boom, so to speak, those first 10 years of the Eisner era. And he does have a lot to, he does deserve a lot of credit. He was the CEO. But honestly, it was Frank Wells that really made that magic happen. He was the guy who kind of countered Michael Eisner, and they get into that in this documentary. And they were the perfect mix. It was like a Walt and Roy situation, okay? And when he died, when Frank Wells passed away, it really did create a void in Disney, and you can really see the change of quality and success after Frank's death. Right? You can really see that after he died in 1994. Again, this isn't like a diss on Michael Eisner. I'm not taking away anything for what Michael Eisner contributed to the company, because like I said in my last video, I think Michael Eisner deserves to get a Disney Legends Award. The man deserves it. He saved the company. But I think that team, the Eisner Frank Wells team is really what worked the best. Okay, when they were together, it was like running on all cylinders, and the company was doing fantastic. And when we lost Frank Wells, that was a huge blow to the Walt Disney Company. And I'm really glad that the Imagineers honored him with the window on Main Street, and also a little Easter egg in the Matterhorn. If you ride the Matterhorn, you'll see Wells Expedition. That's an homage to the late great Frank Wells. But overall, this episode was really good. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't my favorite of the three. I think my favorite is still episode 1, when they really dove into the history of Disneyland. But this episode was solid, and you learn a lot, and it was really fun kind of getting into the behind the scenes of that Eisner era, because it's a very interesting era indeed in Disney history. So, but overall, what do you guys think? Did you watch episode 3? What are your thoughts on it? I would love to hear from you guys. Thank you all so much for watching. I do content on Disney, the parks, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, all of it, all the time. And as always, have a great, big, beautiful tomorrow.